Suddenly, the prairie was covered with human beings, running in all directions like ants. We all ran as we were, some with babies on their backs, not even thinking, through clouds of panic. Others ran out of the tent colony. The men went for the rifles. Mary Thomas.
Southern Colorado. Coalfields. The early 1900s. A time of growth and prosperity. The demand for human labor grows. The immigrants who fill this demand are the first to be exploited and denied their rights by the very people who have the responsibility to protect them, their employers. From 1880 to 1924, more than 26 million people migrated to America. Fleeing poverty, religious, or ethnic persecution, they came hoping for a better life in the United States. Workers fled to this country, seeking new opportunities. Many were miners. Miners' work was seasonal, and few were able to work 200 days a year. They were paid in scrip, a check only to be used at company stores and company towns. Using this system of payment, mine owners controlled workers' rights.
They were dependent on the coal company for everything. The coal company regulated their movements in and out of the company towns. They regulated what books they could read in the company library. Miners had to use company doctors, so they were very much dominated by the coal company.
They mined for coal, iron, gold, copper, and other minerals throughout the West. They worked long, hard days, but most miners had no other skill other than mining. They were frightened to leave. "The moment I quit mining," one employee said, "the company will set their thugs on my tail." In Colorado, there were two companies that produced fuel and iron, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, CF&I, and Victor Fuel Company. The largest and most successful, CF&I, was founded in 1880 and purchased by John D. Rockefeller in 1903. In southern Colorado, the soft rock coal mines were especially dangerous.
Men in coal mines in those days spent most of their time on their knees or their backs. And the only light they had in the mines was a candle in their caps. So it was dark all the time, and it was wet.
There were other dangers. For instance, a Starkville miner was kicked by a mule and thrown against a steel pipe that was driven through his head. A friend later testified that the wounded miner lay at the bottom of a shaft for 4 hours before he received medical attention, even though it was the responsibility of the company to ensure his safety. Workers despised powerful coal companies that did not have the right to unionize, nor did they have bargaining power. Although the death tolls increased, companies continued to neglect their responsibility to protect the miners' rights and safety. In 1905, Congressman Henry George Jr. said, "These owners of Colorado make and unmake the makers of laws as easily and quietly as they make and unmake the laws themselves." Finally, in 1913, taking responsibility for their rights, the miners came up with 7 demands that they presented to the company owners. However, talk of a strike had been brewing long before this. Precedent had been set during the strike in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, as early as 1892. The miners had been trying to form unions, but to no avail. That same year, an Italian labor organizer, Jerry Lippiat, was killed on the streets of Trinidad, Colorado. The murderers were 2 Baldwin Phelps detectives, hired by Rockefeller's corporation. They sent a wave of anger through the mining towns. At a meeting in Trinidad shortly after the murder, miners listened to an arousing speech by 80-year-old workers' rights activist, Mother Jones. She said, "What would the coal in these hills be worth unless you put your strength and your muscle into bringing it? You have collected more wealth, created more wealth than they in 1,000 years, and yet you have not any." The miners voted to strike. The official call to go on strike went out on September 17, 1913. "All mine workers are hereby notified that a strike of all the coal miners and coke oven workers in Colorado will begin on Tuesday, September 23, 1913. We are striking for improved conditions, better wages, and union recognition. We are sure to win." The leaders of the United Mine Workers of America, the UMWA, helped to organize the strike and provided the miners and their families with tents. The UMWA, founded in 1890, was a union built for the purpose of protecting workers' rights across the country.
Tent colonies were located near Walsenburg, Aguilar, Forbes, Starkville, and Ludlow, Colorado. They were set up in strategic spots in order to intercept any strikebreakers or scabs. Each colony included many nationalities: Italians, Greeks, Eastern Europeans, Mexicans, African Americans, and Welsh. All they had in common was the determination to be treated like humans and to claim a rightful piece of the American dream. Colorado Governor Elias Ammons mobilized the National Guard on October 28, 1913. But as members of the regular National Guard grew tired of the long tour of duty, more company gunmen began appearing in uniform. These thugs were drawing double paychecks, explained union organizer Mike Lavoda, one from the National Guard and one from the companies. Governor Ammons withdrew all but 2 detachments from the field on April 14, 1914. The miners and their families were on strike for nearly 7 months. They had lasted through the difficult winter of 1913 and 1914, one of the worst in Colorado history. Spring came, bringing new hope to the strike. On April 19, 1914, they gathered together to celebrate Greek Easter. The next day, early in the morning, 3 bombs went off in the Ludlow tent colony to signal troops at other positions. Within seconds, guardsmen and miners exchanged gunfire. Bullets flew through the tents. Women and children screamed and ran to take cover. In efforts to make peace, Louis Tikas, a Greek leader, raced through the Ludlow camp with the white flag. He knew of women and children trapped under the tents that were set on fire, and tried to get the guardsmen to stop fighting and put out the fire. Instead, they captured Tikas along with 2 other miners and shot them in the back. By 7 p.m., the tent colonies were in flames. When rescuers finally brought the bodies out of the blackened colony, they found 2 women and 11 children who had taken refuge in a pit and suffocated to death when the tent above them was set on fire. This became known as the Death Pit. The death toll rose to 25 people who died at Ludlow that day. When the news of Ludlow got out, strikers from other tent colonies were enraged. In what looked like a war, striking miners attacked and destroyed southern Colorado mines for 10 days. Governor Ammons sent a desperate plea for federal intervention to President Wilson. Not until word came that national troops were on their way did the fighting stop on April 30th. The Ludlow tent colony was then rebuilt. Out of money and resolve, the UMWA finally called off the strike on December 10, 1914. The strike had dragged on for 15 months. As for the miners, some remained on the UMWA relief until February of 1915. Others were said to have gone back to work for CF&I. Hearings were held by the United States Commission on Industrial Relations in 1915. The commission took testimony from major principals, including John D. Rockefeller, Jr. of CF&I and Frank Walsh, a labor lawyer. The commission argued for workers' rights to organize, restrictions on the use of private detective agencies such as Baldwin Phelps, and the responsibility for state intervention in protecting workers' rights. After the Ludlow Massacre, companies tried to gain back the trust of their workers. As written for CF&I, the Colorado Industrial Plan established a company union on January 1, 1916. As John D. Rockefeller, Jr. wrote in the plan, "I frankly confess that I felt there was something fundamentally wrong in a condition of affairs which made possible the loss of human lives." By the end of the 1920s, nearly 1.5 million workers were enrolled in these plans nationwide. However, these plans were a weak solution for protecting workers' rights.
In the 1930s, when the National Labor Relations Act is passed and the Wagner Act's passed under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, at that point, workers get, number one, the right to belong to a union, the right to go out on a strike.
Ludlow was a watershed event in American labor history. The strike did not achieve its goals or gain all the rights it had hoped to, but it planted seeds of reform to create independent labor unions years later. These strikers paved the way for many rights workers now take for granted.
It was things like the Ludlow Massacre and this whole event that started causing the employees to have rights and the employers to start recognizing those rights.
In the wake of Ludlow, corporate management relations began to turn from violent confrontation to negotiated settlements. Between the years of 1884 and 1912, nearly 43,000 coal miners were killed in mining accidents across the United States. 1,700 of these were in Colorado mines because of the lack of responsibility from the companies. Coal mining has never been a safe or easy profession. Today, it is still considered the second most hazardous job. However, miners now have an 8-hour workday, safer working conditions, and better wages. Mining companies assume more responsibility to protect the rights of their workers.
It was early springtime and the strike was on. It drove us miners out of doors, out from the houses that the